Have you ever wondered why racism exists? Why the color of one's skin could hold power over another's fate? Why for centuries were black people across Africa and beyond treated as inferior and less human? Imagine stepping back in time to the age when European explorers first set foot on African soil. They did not just see a new land, they saw an opportunity. They viewed the people they encountered as resources instead of fellow humans. What actually drove them to invent all the evil lies, making Africans seem different, savaged, even less involved? To so many, it was out of simple greed. But what if it was something far deeper at play? What if everything you thought you knew about the history of racism was only half the truth? What if there is a hidden story behind the brutal system that stripped black people of their rights and humanity? These are the questions that begin to scratch the surface of the origin of racism. But in this video, we are going to dig deeper in order to expose a dark, troubling reality, one where lies were spun, power was seized, and a legacy of injustice was born. But to truly understand how it all started, we need to go back to a time when the world was taking shape, and human interaction was beginning to cross continents. It was in the late 15th century, and during this time, European nations were expanding and searching for new resources, territories, and power. They have heard rumors of land filled with riches to the south. In Africa, land full of gold, ivory, and other valuable resources. What they saw when they arrived, however, is more than wealth. They saw an opportunity for domination, and they seized it in a way that changed the world forever. As European explorers reached African shores, they encountered people who looked different, spoke different languages, and had distinct cultures. Rather than appreciating these differences, many European leaders and merchants saw an opportunity. They viewed Africans not as equal humans, but as resources, no different from the gold and species they are after. This was not due to any biological fact, it was a calculated decision to dehumanize. For them, treating Africans as equal would mean sharing the wealth and power. By viewing them as less beings, they justified exploiting them without guilt. This isn't about curiosity or misunderstanding, it is all about power. As European taste for resources grew, so did its need for labor. Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, packed into ships and sent to Americas to work in a plantation under brutal conditions. For this horrific system to function, the Europeans had to justify their actions. They spread lies, myths, and stereotypes, portraying Africans as savage, unintelligent, and inherently suited for labor. This wasn't just convenient, it was the foundation for racism. These racist beliefs were taught, spread, and embedded into every aspect of Europeans and American society. Black people were described in a way that made them seem subhuman. Terms like uncivilized and primitive were used deliberately to create a false narrative that Europeans were somehow superior. This racist mindset became so ingrained that it still echoes today. The so-called Enlightenment era in Europe, time when science and reasons were celebrated, also became a dark period in the history of racism. Thinkers and scientists, many whom were Europeans, began using pseudo-scientific theory to clarify and rank race. This idea was simple. If they could prove that Africans were naturally inferior, then the exploitation could continue without remorse. Prominent scientists created measurements of skull shape and body size to argue that black people were less intelligent than white people. It was a bogus science, but it provided a rational explanation that fueled slavery and colonization. These false sciences were taught in schools, preached from pulpit, and written into law. It wasn't just accepted, it became widely heard truth that justified centuries of oppression. When the Europeans scrambled for Africa in the late 19th century, they didn't just take land, they divided entire communities and culture. They carved up Africa like a cake, splitted nations and families without a second thought. The British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and others took what they wanted and left chaos behind. Colonizers established hierarchies that placed Africa at the bottom and the European settlers at the top. Laws were written to enforce racial segregation, keeping black Africans as second-class citizens in their own land. The idea was clear. Africans were seen as servants of European interests, while Europeans were the civilizers. Colonialism did not just strip Africa of its resources. It ingrained in both Africa and Europe mindset a toxic notion of racial superiority and inferiority. African traditions, language, and culture were dismissed as primitive. European values were held up as the gold standard. This was a deliberate strategy to suppress Africans' pride and identity, keeping generations of people under terms of colonial rule. Meanwhile, in literature, art, and letters and films, Africans and African-descended people were portrayed as savage, brute, and exotic others. European writers, artists, and filmmakers crafted a distorted image of black people that was circulated worldwide. These images wasn't just offensive, it was designed to reinforce the idea that Africans were somehow lesser and in need of European guidance or control. These images made their way back to Europe and across Atlantics to the Americas, where they fueled more racism. It was a vicious circle. The more black people were depicted as less than human, the more the world accepted these lies as fact. The scars left by this centuries-old belief are deep. They impacted the lives of black people globally in a way that are often invisible but painful felt. Economic exploitations of African resources left many African nations struggling to develop even after independence. The education system in many former colonies were designed to enrich African history and promote European superiority. Meanwhile, in Americas, the legacy of slavery still shows in the socio-economic inequality faced by African Americans today. In South Africa, apartheid was a system that literally translated the idea of colonialism into everyday law that kept black South Africans under the control of a small white minority. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was one of many cases where these colonial ideas were kept alive long after the colonizers left. Yet, through all this, black communities has fought and continue to fight for their freedom, dignity, and recognition. From the revolts of slave ships to the Haitian Revolution, from the civil rights movement to the anti-apartheid struggles, black people around the world have never accepted these lies. Figures like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Kwame Nkrumah inspired generations to resist the chains of racism and demand justice and equality. Today, movements like Black Lives Matter remind us that fight against racism is far from over. The stereotypes, structures, and lies created centuries ago are still present, but they are being dismantled pieces by pieces. One of the most powerful acts against racism is the reclaim of African culture, identity, and pride. Across the world, black communities are celebrating African heritage through art, fashion, music, and education. African nations are building economies, telling their own stories, and standing as proud, independent voices in global politics. Racism was a tool to control, exploit black people, and it has succeeded for centuries. But today, that narrative is being challenged, rewritten, and overturned.